it's okay. I enjoy doing it and I want to do more, but I gained the ultimate respect for anybody who's a successful novelist. It's very difficult, but fun just the same. Well, let's start. Last week we talked about some of the main characters, and I'm just going to briefly touch on some of them and augment a little bit to start today. Remember, we discussed there were CEOs and COOs. The CEOs were the emperors in the three imperial countries that had an emperor. The COOs, who really did the work, were Bismarck, Gorchakov, and Andrassy, who we'll introduce today, in Austria-Hungary. And sometimes they got together and worked very well, and other times it was a conflict. There were times when the emperors and their wives and their families, since they were often related, jumped into affairs after the events had been handled on a daily basis by the prime ministers and the real diplomats. So that's part of the plot. These were the names of the people we talked about last week. The Tsars were Alexander II in Russia. We'll learn a little more about him today. Of course, Kaiser Wilhelm I, not Wilhelm II, who started World War I, but this was two emperors before Wilhelm II. Wilhelm I, grandfather. Franz Joseph in Austria, who was around for over 50 years, actually 60 years on the throne. He was very young when he came into power, but stayed until 1917. And then, of course, the real movers and shakers were Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor in the new German state, Gorchakov in Russia, who we'll also learn a little more about today, a fascinating figure, and in France, the Duc de Caz, who was the foreign minister or prime minister throughout this decade. Today we're going to introduce a new character, Andrassy, Hungarian, who's a fascinating character. And our man who provides perspective is the person that I studied the most. Second-rate historical figure, but a first-rate person, General Adolphe Charles Emmanuel Lafleur, who was the French war minister and the French ambassador to Russia afterwards for this whole period. I had a very fascinating life leading up to this. He was 68 when he took this appointment and was in Russia for almost 10 years. So again, let's read just a couple quick notes. Alexander II was the emperor the Tsar in Russia. His father was Nicholas I, the real autocrat. Alexander II is known as the liberator because he legally freed the serfs. He freed the serfs in Russia because of the social instability that was occurring due to the changes in society that we'll talk about during these lectures. I mentioned last week he was educated by a romantic poet. This character figures in my novel. His name is Vasily Zhukovsky, real person. He actually was the best-selling poet in Europe, not just Russia, in Europe, before Lord Byron, before the Romantic period with Byron, Keats, Shelley, and those poets. He was a very well-known figure, and he was already older, and he was hired by, he had been an army officer in the Battle of Borodino in Russia against Napoleon, gained the attention of the higher staff officers for his brilliance, and was hired by the emperor's wife to be the tutor to the royal family. Zhukovsky was very influential on Alexander II, and if you remember last week, he's the person who suggested the Grand Tour, that the young future emperor go on a tour of Europe. And the coincidence in that fact was he ended up in Algeria and stayed in the tent of then Brigadier General Lafleur, which began a lifelong friendship, ending in Lafleur's becoming the diplomat, the ambassador to Russia in 1871. So, interesting story. He was open to liberal ideas, even though he was the Tsar. He knew things were changing. He allowed the reading of some of the great socialist writers, like at that point Alexander Herzen was one of the biggest in Europe, and did not discourage that, did not censor it, which he could have done. So an interesting character, an autocrat, a Tsar, but in many ways a liberal-minded, open-minded person. There were many assassination attempts on his life, and he was ultimately assassinated in 1881, shortly after this period ends. Wilhelm I in Austria is not nearly as colorful as Wilhelm II, but he was the emperor in the new German state during this period. Remember, there was no Germany as we know it until 1871. There were over 300 different principalities that were Germany. And Austria, remember, was the seat of the Holy Roman Empire, was excluded from that after a war with Prussia in 1866. So, he's an interesting character. He had his wife, the Empress Augusta, was influential in society and in diplomacy, a nuisance to Bismarck, and he was the uncle to the Tsar Alexander II, not the first, the second, my mistake. He was the uncle to the Tsar. The Tsar married his niece. So, Bismarck's strategy was to form what was called the Three Emperors League. They use the word Bund. So the Bund is more than a league. It's not a league. It's almost a comradeship. It's hard to translate some German words into English.